On January the 3rd, 1961, 3 young men stood on top of a nuclear reactor in the frozen Idaho desert. They were about to make a simple 4-inch adjustment, but within seconds, one of them would be pinned to the ceiling by a metal rod that shot through his entire body. His remains were so radioactive that it took rescuers an entire week just to figure out how to bring him down. This is the most horrifying nuclear disaster in American history. The emergency call came at 9:01 p.m. Firefighters drove to the SL-1 reactor expecting another false alarm. They'd already dealt with 2 that same day, but when they arrived, they walked into a scene of unimaginable horror. Earlier that evening, 3 military workers had a routine job. Army specialists Richard McKinley and John Burns, along with Navy electrician Richard Legg, were restarting a reactor that had been shut down for Christmas. The main task was simple: lift the central control rod just 4 inches to reconnect it. That's it, 4 inches. Burns grabbed the 84-pound rod with his bare hands. Legg stood beside him on top of the reactor. McKinley watched nearby, still learning the job. They had done this before. It was supposed to be easy, but what happened next defied all logic. Their small reactor was designed to produce 3 megawatts of power. In less than a heartbeat, it surged to 20,000 megawatts. That's almost 7,000 times more powerful than it should have been. This kind of surge should have been impossible, but SL-1 was no ordinary reactor. During the Cold War, America needed radar stations in the most remote places on Earth. These stations would watch for Soviet bombers. The problem was power. These locations had no electrical grids, no supply lines, just brutal cold and isolation. The military's answer was SL-1, a small nuclear reactor that could run for years without refueling. It could be transported anywhere and would generate its own electricity. Brilliant idea. Deadly. Execution. To run for 3 years straight, engineers packed this reactor with 30 pounds of highly enriched uranium, more than what was in the Hiroshima bomb. This made the reactor incredibly sensitive. Even tiny movements of the control rods could cause massive power spikes. The engineers tried to fix this. They added special boron strips that would absorb excess radiation and keep things stable. Great in theory, disastrous in practice. The extreme heat inside the reactor made these strips break apart. The pieces fell into the gaps where the control rods moved, and the rods started jamming. Between 1959 and 1960, the control rods jammed over 80 times. 80 warnings that something was very wrong, but there were bigger problems. Most nuclear reactors sit inside thick concrete bunkers built to contain disasters. SL-1 sat inside a thin steel building meant to keep out bad weather. Nothing more. Most reactors have heavy shielding to protect workers from radiation. SL-1 had a few. Movable lead blocks. The workers stood just feet from the reactor core. In minutes, they absorbed more radiation than a modern worker is allowed in an entire year. In 1 hour, they got more radiation than most people receive in a lifetime. And here's the crazy part. Despite all these safety issues, the military staffed SL-1 with ordinary recruits, not experienced nuclear engineers, just regular guys trained in a 9-month program. The reactor used only 5 control rods to manage everything. Compare that to Chernobyl, which used 211 rods, and the central rod at SL-1 was positioned right above the hottest part of the reactor. If pulled out too far, it could trigger an unstoppable chain reaction. No single control rod should ever have that much power, but at SL-1, everything depended on that one rod. That night, Burns reached down to lift the central rod. He needed to pull it up 4 inches. 4 inches. But instead, for reasons no one will ever fully understand, he yanked it up 20 inches. What happened next took 4 milliseconds. The reactor went prompt, critical. Nuclear reactions exploded out of control. Power shot past 20,000 megawatts. The water inside instantly turned to superheated radioactive steam. Pressure went from normal to absolutely catastrophic in a fraction of a second. The steam exploded upward with such incredible force that it lifted the entire 26,000-pound reactor 9 feet into the air. Burns was thrown against a concrete wall. Metal shrapnel flew everywhere, tearing into McKinley. The top of the reactor blew apart. Radioactive water sprayed over everyone, and one of the control rods shot upward like a javelin, impaling Leg through his groin and shoulder and pinning him to the ceiling. The heat sensors triggered the alarm. Firefighters arrived expecting nothing serious. When they entered the building, their radiation detectors screamed 25 Röntgens per hour. They thought their equipment was broken. No way it could be that high. They grabbed a better detector and went back. This time it maxed out at 500 Röntgens per hour. Through the doorway, they saw debris everywhere, but no workers. It took over an hour before they could even attempt a full entry. At 10:30 p.m., they heard moaning. They rushed in and found McKinley barely alive. Burns had no pulse. They got McKinley onto a stretcher and into an ambulance. He died before reaching the highway. The ambulance was so contaminated they had to abandon it in the desert. The third worker was still missing. When rescuers finally scanned the ceiling with a flashlight, they realized what looked like debris was actually Leg's body, still pinned to the ceiling by the control rod. But they couldn't just pull him down. If the rod fell back into the reactor, it could trigger another disaster. And Leg's position was the most radioactive spot in the room. 1,000 Röntgens per hour. Anyone standing under him would receive a lethal dose in minutes. They recovered Burns the next day, but Leg would take a week. Engineers designed a special crane system. Teams went in for just 65 seconds at a time. Using long poles, they freed his body without standing underneath. Each person absorbed dangerous levels of radiation just to bring him down. All three men were buried in lead-lined caskets, sealed in metal vaults and covered with concrete. Too radioactive to be buried normally. Burns was 22 years old. Investigators never determined exactly why the rod was pulled so far. Most likely, a mechanical jam made them pull harder. Some rumors mentioned personal tensions between the men, an alleged affair. None of it was ever proven. What is proven is this. The SL-1 disaster ended the military's portable nuclear program. It changed reactor design forever, new safety systems, better training, and the one rod rule. No single rod can ever have enough power to cause this kind of catastrophe again. To this day, SL-1 remains the only fatal reactor accident in American history. If this story shocked you as much as it did us, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into history's most incredible moments, the disasters, the mysteries, the events that changed everything. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next.